Benjamin Britten's Nocturnal After John Dowland is one of the most intriguing pieces of guitar music ever written. Exactly 60 years ago, on the 12th of June 1964, it was premiered by Julian Bream at the legendary Albury Festival. This video is a comprehensive deep dive into the piece by Professor Stephen Goss. You can watch the entire 33-minute documentary for free over on Tonebase, no trial membership needed. Link is in the video description. But if you just want to have a first impression, here's the first half.
Hello, I'm talking to you from the home of Benjamin Britten. This is where Benjamin Britten and Peter Pears lived from 1957 until he died in 1976. I'm actually sitting in his composition studio, and it was here that he wrote all of his music between 57 and around 1970. And it was at this desk that he wrote his Nocturnal, Opus 70, for guitar. How did a composer like Britten come to write for the instrument? Well, he had the very good fortune to meet Julian Bream. Julian Bream first came to Britten's notice when he started performing songs with Peter Pears. Britten was very interested in old music, in particular the music of John Dowland and Henry Purcell, and was fascinated by the lute. And so when Julian Bream started playing the lute with Peter Pears singing the repertoire of this era, Britten became very interested in the instrument. Pears and Bream started performing together in 1954, when Bream was only 21 years old. By that stage, Peter Pears was a very well-established international singer at the age of 44. They performed many times, and Britten was clearly very taken with their performances. So much so that in 1957 he wrote a song cycle, Songs from the Chinese, which the two performed together for tenor and guitar. Following on from the Songs from the Chinese, Britten set some folk songs for Pears and Bream to play for voice and guitar. But it wasn't until 1963 when Britten wrote his only solo piece for the guitar, Nocturnal After John Dowland. Benjamin Britten once said that composing was like driving down a foggy road towards a house. As you got closer and closer to it, so the details came into focus. And often Britten would think for many years about pieces before they finally came to fruition. Whilst he's said to have written his music at this desk, he said in interviews several times that most of the thinking goes on away from this place. At any time of day, perhaps when he's walking, perhaps when he's thinking somewhere else. And it's clear from the letters, as you can see from this extract here, that Britten was already thinking of a set of variations on a John Dowland song by 1960. And in fact, in another letter from 1959, it seems the idea had already been discussed between Bream and Britten. Bream first asked for a solo piece in around 1955 or 56, at the very precocious age of 22, 23. And he had to wait quite a long time till the piece finally came into fruition. But it's clear that it was a project that Britten was very invested in and wanted to complete. In 1960, Britten's vision was to have some kind of reverse variation form, where you'd start with something incredibly complicated, which would gradually be distilled through into this Dowland song, Come Heavy Sleep. The way the piece worked out in the end was quite different from that, as we'll see. But it's very interesting to see how this sort of cogitation takes place over many years. Benjamin Britten was fascinated by the nighttime, and Nocturnal is clearly a piece of the night. He often said that nighttime was for sleeping, where the subconscious takes over the creative process. And in an interview one time he said the two things he cherishes most in his life are the nighttime and silence. The original title for Nocturnal was Night Fancy, so it was clear that this was at the forefront of his ideas about the piece, rather than necessarily writing a set of variations on a theme of John Dowland. The piece was first performed at the 1964 Albury Festival at the Jubilee Hall by the seafront in Albury. And Bream immediately took it into his repertoire and performed it all over the place. There was a letter from 1965 where he describes the fact that he's already played the piece 23 times on an American tour. So it was clearly a piece that Bream championed and performed at every possible opportunity. It's clear from very early on in the compositional process that Britten wanted to put Dowland's song, Come Heavy Sleep, at the end of his guitar piece. The very first draft, first sketch, has the whole of the song sketched out at the end, followed by a whole load of interesting little manipulations of the first 4 notes of Come Heavy Sleep. So Nocturnal has often been described as being in reverse variation form. That isn't strictly true. What Britten does brilliantly is he takes Dowland's song, Come Heavy Sleep, and he translates it into his own musical language and uses it as a provisional theme at the beginning of the work. And the first 5 movements, if you like, the provisional theme, musingly, and the next 4 variations, are based on that translation. Then from the 6th variation, we begin to get hints of the Dowland song, and the rest of the piece moves towards the Dowland song through a spectacular Passacaglia. One of the most striking things about Nocturnal is Britten's use of dynamics. When the Dowland song appears, it appears pianissimo. And the only 2 dynamics written when the song appears are pianissimo and 3 pianos. It's very, very soft. There are tiny, tiny crescendos, but it never gets as loud as piano. And those dynamics are exactly copied in Musingly, the first movement, which is Britten's translation of the Dowland song. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the way this translation took place to try and give a little bit of insight into Britten's workings as a composer. So what Britten does is he takes Dowland's melody, which is in E major in his version, diatonic piece, and translates it into a kind of octatonic scale. So rather than the octave being split up into sort of major scale, tone, tone, semitone, tone, 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 semitone, it's split up with a kind of diminished 7th filter. So thinking of the important notes of being F sharp, A, C, and E flat. But what Britten does is he doesn't use a normal octatonic scale where he might have the same pattern going throughout. Semitone, tone, semitone, tone, semitone, tone, etc. But he uses a very informal sort of melodic device so that between these kind of fixed minor thirds, the tones and semitones can change. So they give this tonal ambiguity. So if we listen to the beginning of the Dowland song, just the very opening phrase, and then listening to the version that Britten did using this filter, you'll hear what I mean. So what happens now is that Britten weaves this kind of meditation on the Dowland song in his own harmonic language. He makes the rhythm very free, adds lots of decoration, but it follows the song exactly all the way through. And it's possible just to write the words of the song over musically to see how that works. But what he does, which is really interesting, and we'll look in a bit more detail later, is we can see how Dowland actually uses some of the same Motivic techniques that Britten uses. So it's a very careful and clever translation. And as I said a moment ago, musingly sort of becomes a provisional theme, and the next few variations are based entirely on that and not on the Dowland song at all. So we have these 2 very quiet dynamic bookends, pianissimo, 3 Ps and so on. Then the loudest point of the piece comes just before these 2 bookends. So the second movement, very agitated, and the end of the Passacaglia are the loudest moments in the piece. And what happens then, we kind of get the variations are organized dynamically so that the quiet ones get a little bit louder and the loud ones get a little bit softer. And then we have this wonderful, still, calm moment in the middle with the 2 variations, Dreaming, which is variation 6, and Gently Rocking, which is variation 7, which is kind of like a still center. And it's at the beginning of Dreaming where we start moving towards the the Dowland song. At the beginning of Dreaming, Britten very subtly puts in the Passacaglia ground in the middle of the texture. This is the first time we hear that. And it sort of keeps recurring through the Dreaming movement. And then at the beginning of Gently Rocking, we actually get a diatonic version of the opening of the Dowland song, Come Heavy Sleep. And it's interesting to note that in an early draft of this movement, the Gently Rocking movement, Britten actually takes the melody verbatim in the top line, repeats the first phrase, then repeats the second phrase. Later, perhaps he thought this was too unsubtle, scribbled it out, and came up with what we have now in the final score. As a composer, Britten used variation form many times in his output. He also used the Passacaglia form, probably most famously in the C interludes of Peter Grimes. The Passacaglia in Nocturnal is different from all other Passacaglias by Britten and possibly all other Passacaglias by anyone, in as much as the Passacaglia bass theme actually occurs between the little variations rather than underneath them. And it's a very characteristic melodic shape. So on the guitar it's C, B, A, G, F natural, E. Now that's a very interesting intervallic shape, because what you have is a palindrome. You have a semitone, tone, 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 semitone. This figure, of course, comes from the accompaniment at the very beginning of the song that you see here. And here it runs from E down to G sharp, but it has the same intervallic relationship, semitone, tone, 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 semitone. So these two are sort of inextricably linked. And it's almost as if the Passacaglia theme is this sort of annoying thing that once you sort of finally see it in the light of day, it's inconsequential. But at night time, it becomes this kind of nagging persistence. The way Britten organizes the harmony of Nocturnal is incredibly interesting and sophisticated. Like he split the octave into 4 with his diminished 7th pitch filters, the harmonic plan of the piece has the octave split into 3. And the 3 most important keys throughout are C, E, and G sharp. If we look at the Passacaglia theme, it runs from C down to E, and then its continuation in Slow and Quiet runs from E down to G sharp. If we look at Britten's translation of Come Heavy Sleep in Musingly, we'll see that he's using C as a kind of tonal area, and then when the chorus begins here on the score, it moves to E, a major third away. Then when Slow and Quiet comes back at the end, it's in E to begin with, and then when it moves a third, it moves to G sharp. So this kind of tonal plan is underpinning the entire piece. The Passacaglia itself builds in 3 waves. It starts very soft, reaches the first climax, goes down again, reaches a second climax, which is bigger than the first, goes down again, reaches the final third climax before it kind of disappears, dissolves into the final song. And this kind of 3-wave dynamic approach is typical of Britten's music elsewhere. Again, best example coming in the C interludes of Peter Grimes, where you get a similar kind of 3-waved approach. Something that's been said of Britten's music before and makes it different from the kind of pastoral music of Vaughan Williams and other earlier 20th century composers is the fact that Britten's music is very much geared towards the sea, and it has a kind of islanded nature. So rather than the countryside, the sea. So you'll often hear horizons or waveforms in much of his music. We can also look at a very ingenious way that Britten uses tiny little elements from Dowland's song and translates them into his own language and makes them work for him. Perhaps one of the most interesting is the very opening line of the song, Come Heavy Sleep, as you can see it here, and hear it played. If we look at these intervals, in the final section we have G sharp going to B, going to F sharp, going to E. The falling fourth is very typical of kind of melancholic music, which is what I was talking about a little earlier. But what's very interesting about the way this motive works is if you translate it to G major, the pitch of the lute, you have B, D, A, G. And if you just switch the octave of the A and the D, you have the 4 middle open strings of the guitar. So that what Britten is doing here, unbelievably ingeniously, is he's making the song provide the harmonic language for the piece that suits the open strings of the instrument. And throughout the piece, Britten uses this kind of very informal harmonic style, using chords which are quartal chords built in fourths, but also having this rogue third as we have in the middle 4 strings of the guitar. And this is an incredible harmonic feature and something that's invented purely for this piece. Here are various examples of where you can see this harmony being used throughout the piece. The next phrase, the image of true death, is almost kind of made for Britten's style, because as you can see in the melody here, we have the A in the first part of the phrase and an A sharp in the second part. So when Britten translates that into his own version amusingly at the beginning of the piece, he doesn't have to change anything, he copies it exactly, and it's in Britten's style. So there's this really strong relationship between Britten's approach and Dowland's approach, and it kind of affects all aspects of Britten's composition. Britten was very interested in Dowland's music, and particularly in the kind of Renaissance notion of melancholy and sadness and weeping. And it's the melancholic aspects of Come Heavy Sleep that pervade the whole score of Nocturnal. And we can see that Britten is using these Renaissance rhetorical devices in his 20th century musical language. So here are some examples later in the piece where you can see Britten uses this figure, the image of true death, totally unfiltered in various different circumstances throughout the work. One of the interesting tonal relationships that we see in the first movement musingly is that between E major and F minor. The only triad that's heard in the whole of Nocturnal is an E major triad, and that's only really heard in its pure form right at the end of the Passacaglia. But what Britten does in musingly at the beginning, when he has that chord, that first E major chord marked 3 pianos, is he offsets the F that comes in above it by a quarter note, so that when you get the F, you hear that tension between the F and the E major. Now, this was a harmonic device that Britten used throughout his career, the idea of taking a major triad, in this instance E major, and then a minor triad, 1 semitone higher, F minor. They both share the same third, so the third of an E major chord is G sharp, the third of an F minor chord is A flat equivalent to G sharp. The very opening of the opera Billy Budd begins with this relationship, with B minor against B flat major. And also we can see it in a number of other pieces by Benjamin Britten. Another well-known example is in A Midsummer Night's Dream, here. So this tension between the E major and the F minor forms a large argument of these first 5 movements of Nocturnal. And then that kind of disappears in the second half, where we start moving towards the Dowland song. So that kind of gives some insights into kind of what's going on analytically within the piece and musically, and the kind of techniques that Britten is using in translating Dowland's song into his idiom. The way that he's getting away from a tonal idiom without becoming too atonal, by splitting the octave in different ways. So rather than having a major scale, he split it into 4, as in the diminished 7th filter, F sharp, A, C, E flat, for example, and also dividing it into 3, C, E, and G sharp, these major thirds, so we get these kind of important tonal areas that kind of dominate the work.